It's worth remembering that Palestinian identity, especially political Palestinian identity, is not based on the idea of making a Palestinian state that lives alongside a Jewish Israeli state. It's based predominantly in mainstream Palestinian discourse on what they call resisting or eradicating the Jewish state. And that's why I think this is a disruption of a long-entrenched, failed orthodoxy. And it really is the unveiling of a vision that dares to reimagine the Middle East in starkly different terms. But as you say, the prospect of moving 1.5 million to 2 million people from the Gaza Strip is certainly not to be taken lightly. So the question is, would it be a forced transfer? Would it be a voluntary transfer? All these sorts of details were not mentioned by Donald Trump, possibly because this is never going to happen, or possibly because it's not about the details and he does intend to make it happen, but it will be done voluntarily. There are many possibilities there. I mean, for example, Trump said that it's virtually impossible for those people to move back to their homes. So when we saw
they're not there anymore, are they?
Exactly. I mean, many of them returned north during the hostage deal period that we've been witnessing for the last couple of weeks, given that permission to do so, only to find they didn't have homes or infrastructure there and they went south again. So if that's the case, it would be quite reasonable for third-party countries to open their doors, as happens with refugee populations around the world in war-torn areas. I mean, many people here took in Ukrainians when Russia invaded Ukraine in their homes. So the idea that the Arab world has actually closed its doors and closed the border, for example, with Egypt all the way through this war, rather than welcoming in Arab Palestinians in order to escape from danger, is preposterous. Not preposterous that now they might do so in order to help give those people a better life should they choose to leave themselves. So I think that is one fundamental part of the discussion. But just to say, the other part of this is that Trump is a politician, a leader, a president who specializes in political theatrics and, let's say, organized chaos. So his suggestion here was something which is really a catalyst for further discussion of what might happen. It may be just a technique to pressure Egypt and Jordan into accepting his proposition that they should take some of these Palestinians from Gaza in, but not necessarily to be taken literally that he's going to occupy, that America is going to occupy the Gaza Strip. That said, with Donald Trump, you never know, and I think we have to keep an open mind. Sometimes in the Middle East, you need to believe what people actually tell you.
Well, you know what they say about Donald Trump, you should take him seriously, but not literally. And I did think that Netanyahu, they've had their differences in the past, but they were genuinely, obviously friendly last night. Netanyahu said there has never been a man in the White House a president that's been more friendly to Israel than Donald Trump. So there's no doubt about their genuine closeness politically. And Netanyahu's quite clearly quite likes this plan. But I did see him bristle slightly when Donald Trump said, well, you know, America might have to invade, might take over Gaza, take over the running of the Gaza Strip. Well, I think that's sort of probably pushing it a bit, isn't it?
Well, for decades, world leaders have clung to really exhausted formulas like the two-state fantasy. I think it's been clear to many people for years that wasn't a realistic proposition because, as I said, one side has repeatedly turned down having their own state. That's the Palestinians. So given that that's the case, I think what Trump was hoping to do here was completely reset the terms, a sort of reset against this Palestinian fundamental rejectionism and to face the realities. Let's not forget that in his last term in office, Donald Trump made this so-called deal of the century in which he offered the Palestinians another alternative solution, which they also rejected, like every other single offer they've been made throughout their history for statehood or independence. So this time, it's no surprise if he's coming back with a deal that is somewhat worse in terms, because that's how negotiation works, and Donald Trump is a negotiator.
I was going to say, in terms of the two-state solution that people like Keir Starmer and the Western nations are fond of embracing, where is the two-state solution in the Palestinians' favourite slogan, from the river to the sea? That's a one-state solution involving the annihilation and extermination of Israel, isn't it?
Well, indeed it is. And the concept of a two-state proposition is also one that's been really unrealistic for years, if not decades, never mind since October the 7th. And that's because, on the one hand, as you say, the regular slogan of "from the river to the sea" it means the eradication of the State of Israel. But more importantly as well, the UN has been fundamental in perpetuating the conflict by constantly extending the so-called Palestinian refugee problem. So every Palestinian in Gaza or in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank is considered a refugee. Palestinians living in other countries, Britain, America, they're also refugees. Unlike any other refugee population, the UN body that looks after Palestinians specifically says that they can inherit refugee status even if they're citizens of another country. So this is a problem that also needs to be dealt with, and perhaps less flashy, less headline making today were some of the other things that Donald Trump announced yesterday as well, which is that the US is withdrawing funding from the UN.
I was going to say that. So it's UNRWA, isn't it? And he's also withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council. And
Israel has followed suit on that one as well.
But you must, as a supporter of Israel, Jewish journalist, you must have. I personally was thrilled by that, because I'll tell you what infuriates me about that half-wit Antonio Guterres, who runs the United Nations. Before even October the 7th, regularly the UN would pass, about sort of 7 or 8 condemnations of Israel every week. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that the United Nations has acted like an anti-Semitic organization in terms of Israel. And Donald Trump stood up for that, stood against that. So I applaud these moves by him, don't you?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact is that many people who don't follow these things closely assume the UN is some sort of supranational whiter-than-white body that only works for the greater good. But in reality, if you just think about it logically, it's got so many corrupt, non-democratic, and even Arab countries making it up that, of course, it ended up with this anti-Semitic, anti-Israel bias. And the UN Human Rights Council is just one such example. For example, it has a set agenda item dedicated only to Israel. That's the only country in the world that it does that for. So even if you have a low opinion of Israel and its human rights record, which is it's wrong if you do, but even if you do, it's preposterous that Israel has this special obsession and this special focus in the council when no other country does. Not China, not Syria under Assad, none of these places, only Israel. So Trump has withdrawn funding, and also the US representative there, and Israel has followed suit. And this does an awful lot to kind of rip out that sense of respectability. The fact that the Secretary General has dug in this evening, making a speech about the inalienable rights of the Palestinians, etc., and recommitting to this two-state fantasy, only shows that the UN, even when being dragged by the nose by the US, is just completely adamant that we shouldn't find a real solution. And why is that important? Not just for Israel, but also for the Palestinians. If people really care about the Palestinians, the idea of the UN keeping them in perpetual refugee status, constantly punishing them so that their corrupt leaders can just clean up, vacuum up more money, and that the UN itself and all these other agencies can just keep going, all these endless salaries, absolutely ridiculous. It shows that they've got no commitment to trying to improve the lives of Palestinians.
They haven't. The thing is, Jonathan, a lot of people reveal how ridiculous. Well, it wasn't. It's about time somebody created a new narrative. And I think that's why Benjamin Netanyahu is right behind the president here. I think, as we've discussed, some of the facets of his master plan, are going to be tough to achieve, to say the least. But if we can change the narrative, change the discussions, change the playing field around which the Middle East ongoing debate revolves, then that's going to be a good thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the concept that you might in some way try to allow people from Gaza, who we've been hearing for the entire duration of this war are suffering greatly because of the war, the idea that you would stop them or be against an idea that allowed them to settle somewhere of their own will and have a better life, free from the constraints of the tyranny of Hamas and other corrupt Palestinian leadership, the idea that you would get in the way of that, again, shows a lack of interest in the lives of those people. But above all else, whether or not we take Trump totally seriously and totally at face value for this plan, his vision is likely to terrify those who've grown comfortable with the status quo, because it's going to unsettle all those people who prefer this diplomatic inertia to the hard truths. This is the population in Gaza which burst across the border into Israel on the 7th of October and carried out the most horrific, barbaric assault and slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust. So it's peculiar that there is such an excessive amount of hand-wringing about those people, as opposed to what they did and continued to do and have continued to say they would do again and again if they were given the opportunity. So this is going to enrage people who've built their careers and reputations and fortunes, financial fortunes, on the perpetuation of this constantly unsolvable problem. Donald Trump should be commended for coming up with new ideas which are based on reality. If Barack Obama was given a Nobel Peace Prize less than 8 months into his presidency for, well, nothing, then maybe it's time that Donald Trump should be considered for it, for having done so much more in his first term and in his first 3 weeks of this term. He has done so much more to help with this rebalancing of the Middle East that he and Benjamin Netanyahu and their advisors have carefully worked at. The Middle East is an entirely different scenario than it used to be, and that is in large part because of the bold and brave and heroic acts of Israel. And now there is a US president who seems to be squarely behind Israel in protecting itself from this genocidal existential threat that it's faced on 7 fronts, including from Gaza.
It's good to see, and I really like the idea of Donald Trump getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And if even a part of this plan comes into fruition, and we are ridded of the constant spectacle of permanent, eternal conflict, murderous conflict, then both these guys deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, both Netanyahu and Trump.
Remember, arch-terrorist Yasser Arafat got a Nobel Peace Prize. So the idea, again, that people would balk at Donald Trump winning the Nobel Peace Prize just shows that they're not serious about these things. Their hatred of Trump and their hatred of his methods of carrying out negotiations and engaging on the world stage absolutely stands above and beyond any actual evaluation of the suggestions he's making or the actions he's putting in place in order to try to improve the situation in the Middle East. But Donald Trump is immune to that kind of mockery as well, and that is why he is the kind of person that can do this. I said in that column in The Spectator that this Trump plan, whether taken seriously or not, is the emperor's new clothes of geopolitics, because once he said it, everybody can see the nakedness of the situation. Everybody can see how nakedly ridiculous it's been to constantly do the same thing again and again and pretend that the Palestinians had different intentions from the ones they clearly demonstrated on October the 7th and have done throughout their history of rejectionism and violence and terrorism aimed at Jews and Israel. Donald Trump has called that out. He's called time on that. And I think it's about time the West got in line with what he's saying, the rest of the West.
Yeah, I mean, it is ridiculous the way that all of the Western democracy, or all of the Guardian readers of this world, both of them, you just constantly say, well, it's a two-state solution. It's got to be the two-state solution. The Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, all for them. So they ought to get that through their thick heads. Jonathan, really great article, by the way. Enjoyed reading it, and thank you very much for coming on. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.